Okay, thank you. Can you all hear me? Okay? Okay, great. Okay, so sweat has a bad reputation. We try to stop sweat with antiperspirants. We admire people who don't sweat under pressure, like athletes with ice in their veins. But sweating serves a critical physiological function. When the human body becomes overheated, sweat cools the body. For example, we sweat when we exercise or when the temperature is warm. So why am I sweating right now? Even though I'm hardly moving and it's cool in here. Turns out sweat also has important psychological meaning. Sweat is a product of the sympathetic nervous system, and strong sweating responses may be a marker of the well-known fight or flight response. However, contemporary situations that require fighting or fleeing are not very common. I probably don't need to fight or escape from you, for example. Sweating is also a marker of the behavioral inhibition system, a neurophysiological, motivational system that inhibits impulsive behaviors or promotes caution in situations that involve threat or potential negative consequences. For example, our sweating might increase when we consider saying something unpopular in a faculty meeting. Or children's sweating might increase when they face peers who mock others or parents who are harshly critical. In such situations, sweating may be a signal that we should forego any motivation to take social risks, or that we should inhibit an impulse to be aggressive. Or sweating may be an indication that we are inhibiting these impulses. But some individuals don't sweat much in these situations, and this may be a sign of insensitivity to threat or negative consequences, of fearlessness or impulsivity. These individuals may fail to learn from negative consequences and therefore continue to exhibit behaviors that lead to further negative consequences. The psychological meaning of sweating is relatively well established, based on studies which show that potential negative consequences and inhibitory efforts induce sweating on average. But the degree to which sweating responses can modify the effects of social experiences is less clear. Research increasingly shows that the effects of social experiences depend on attributes of the child. In other words, children are not equally affected by the same experiences. So we've been interested in children's negative experiences with parents and peers. In particular, we're interested in peer victimization, or the extent to which children are targeted with physical or verbal or social aggression by their peers, and harsh parenting, the extent to which children experience parental aggression and hostility. We already know that peer victimization and harsh parenting predict aggressive behaviors, in part because these experiences can elicit retaliation, as well as depressive feelings, in part because these experiences can be degrading. But we want to know if peer victimization and harsh parenting have different effects on children depending on the activity of their behavioral inhibition system, so depending on how much they sweat in response to challenges or threats. So in one study, for example, just before the transition to middle school, we asked adolescents to lead a conversation with a research assistant. And the adolescent participants were led to believe that same-age peer judges were watching and evaluating their performance in the conversation activity through Skype, although the peer judges actually didn't exist. The peer judges ultimately indicated that the target participant did not perform as well as others in the conversation activity. And we measured adolescent sweating before and throughout this activity with electrodes on the palm of their non-dominant hand, as you can see in this picture. And here are the mean sweating responses. As you can see, an increase in sweating in response to challenge is normal, and greater increases may reflect greater sensitivity to the challenge and greater activation of the behavioral inhibition system. We also asked adolescents and their teachers how much they were victimized by their peers. And before and after the transition to middle school, we asked adolescents and their parents and their teachers to report on the adolescents' levels of aggressive behaviors and depressive symptoms. And we found that peer-victimized early adolescents with lower sweating responses exhibited higher levels of aggressive behavior than their counterparts with less peer victimization or higher sweating responses. And this result was consistent across informants of aggressive behavior. Peer victimization also predicted increases in early adolescents' depressive symptoms across the transition to middle school among adolescents with lower sweating responses, but less so among adolescents with higher sweating responses. And this result was consistent across informants of peer victimization. So the more adolescents were victimized, the more their depressive symptoms increased, especially if they were low sweaters. Peer victimization did not predict aggressive behavior and only inconsistently and barely predicted depressive symptoms among adolescents with high sweating responses. So again, sweating is a marker of caution at the physiological level, and adolescents who sweat more may inhibit responses to peer victimization that make bad situations worse. Adolescents who sweat less may lack caution and fail to put the brakes on negative responses. In fact, we have evidence that increased revenge seeking partially explains the increases in depressive symptoms among peer-victimized early adolescents with low sweating responses. In a separate study, we examined harsh parenting and children's sweating responses to cognitive and interpersonal stressors in the lab. And we found that children with harsh parents and low sweating responses exhibited high and stable levels of aggressive behavior from middle childhood through late childhood. Others have replicated and extended these results by showing that harsh parenting predicts increases in aggressive behaviors in children who have low sweating responses, but not in children with high sweating responses. So again, children who sweat less are more susceptible to social stress. So it seems that sweating responses protect against the negative effects of direct aggression from peers and parents, perhaps because caution is adaptive in precarious contexts. To use an analogy, peer victimization and harsh parenting are social contexts that push the gas pedal, that may increase anger and frustration, and sweating is a measure of the brakes. We need good brakes in situations that push the gas pedal, or we run the risk of losing control, of making risky situations worse. Here's what happens when we have bad brakes. So Calvin says, I have a hypothetical question. Suppose a kid at school called me a nasty name. Should I kick him real hard in the shins? And Hobbes says, no, I don't think violence would be justified. And Calvin says, well, here's another hypothetical question. What if I already did? So too late on the brakes. It's important to note that the effects of sweating responses are not always straightforward. The risk or protective functions of sweating responses may depend in part on the nature of the negative social experience, on the type of stress task used to elicit sweating, and on the particular outcome in question. It's also important to note that we don't tend to find strong direct effects of sweating responses on children's outcomes. The effects of sweating responses really depend on the environmental context. And so strong sweating responses may be a marker of positive adaptation only in negative social contexts in which caution can actually prevent problems. In safe or positive social contexts, strong sweating responses may be a marker of unnecessary fear and inhibition and may actually be a marker of anxiety disorders. Okay, in addition to these complexities, I want to mention a couple of interesting applied implications. First of all, although we find that adolescents with low sweating responses face greater risk in negative social contexts, we also find that these adolescents benefit from non-negative parental control efforts. So for example, we've shown in one study and replicated in another study that parents' efforts to direct adolescents toward pro-social friends and away from peers involved in antisocial activities predicts better social outcomes among adolescents with lower sweating responses, but not among adolescents with higher sweating responses. So it seems that parents' efforts to impose some control or put the brakes on adolescents with physiological markers of impulsivity and fearlessness helps. There's also evidence that interventions can increase sweating responses over time. For example, sweating responses increased among children with ADHD who received an effective behavioral intervention. And a preschool program designed to enrich social skills and cognitive development predicted or produced increased sweating responses in late childhood. We're finding that the effects of the environment, the effects of the social context, depend on attributes of the child. And children's physiological responses to stress seem to be important modifiers of these environmental effects. In terms of intervention implications, it would be ideal to reduce children's experiences with peer victimization and harsh parenting. But to the extent that these negative experiences occur, it may also be helpful to target cognitive or behavioral correlates of children's risky physiological responses. And as technology for assessment of physiological responses improves, it may also be possible and productive to develop interventions that change risky physiological responses directly. Such interventions have the potential to protect children against negative outcomes such as aggression and depression. Okay, in closing, I hope you'll understand my sweating as a sign of deference for this opportunity to speak with you. And remember that sweating, it isn't so bad, at least among children exposed to direct social threats. I want to thank my faculty and student collaborators, the parents and children and teachers who participated in this research, the agencies who funded it, and thanks to all of you for listening.